Greetings, history friends. Professor Eagan here, coming to you with our first look at some Greek notes as we get into some of the geographic, topographic, religious, and cultural aspects of the early Greeks as we move along in our awesome tour so far of ancient and classical cultures. So one of the first things we want to look at, guys, is what we have talked about a few times in our class thus far and looked at it with our Zoom sessions, is get a sense of this map, get a sense of the what would be considered the northern Mediterranean region, and specifically how much the Mediterranean Sea to the south of Greece and the Aegean Sea, basically encompassing Greece, had an effect on the development of their culture, how much the Aegean Sea, as we talked about it, is the lifeline of the Greek city-states and the development of Greek civilization. We talked about likening the Aegean Sea and how the Greeks used it to how the Mesopotamians used the Tigris and the Euphrates, how the Egyptians used the Nile. The Aegean Sea was the same. It was a highway. It was a mover of goods. It was a producer of food. It was truly everything to the Greeks. And as the famous Greek scholar says in the classical era, Plato says, we sit like frogs around a pond. And you can really see that from this map, how many of the Greek city-states where you are never more than a day's journey away from the Aegean Sea, from any of the Greek city-states. One of the interesting things we also want to point out, guys, because we focused a lot on it with our look this week on Greek culture, is this place up here, Troy. All right, this is the site of that place that we discussed is the beginning, the traditional, how the Greeks like to see as the beginning of their culture. All cultures, and we've looked at these, have foundational epic stories about where they come from and how they achieve their own sense of self and independence. We as Americans have that, and we talked about that, throughout the 1700s and culminating in the Revolutionary War. But certainly, the Egyptians have foundational stories. We talked about the Mesopotamians having foundational stories with the Epic of Gilgamesh as well. So all cultures throughout the course of history pinpoint certain time periods and certain places where they, come together as a group. And certainly it was the Trojan Wars for the Greeks, which we'll talk about, because out of those stories, you get the first real solid written glimpse of Greek culture, of Greek religious culture, of Greek practice, and in many ways of how the Greeks formed the alphabet up that they would use, and that would be used throughout Greek culture in the Mediterranean to revolutionize communication, to improve the speed, the ease of learning. The Greeks will be certainly to this point in human history the most literate culture that we have looked at so far, with the ease of learning the Greek alphabet and practicing that language, making the ability to read and write and learn available to many more people than we would have seen in Mesopotamia or Egypt. So we've talked about, again, how the Greek geography, and your chapter 5 talks about this, how the Greek geography is divided in so many ways by, mountains, valleys, peninsulas, isthmus, those types of things with the Aegean. And one of the points that we want to talk about is what I brought up in class the other day. And I believe it's one of the central features of history in general, and just an axiom of historical truth, is diversity in geography equals diversity in cultures. I firmly believe that. I firmly believe that your geography, where you grow up, your environment, it doesn't determine you. It certainly doesn't determine you. It doesn't, make you out to be exactly the person that you are, but it certainly does shape you. And it certainly shapes everything about you. It'll shape how you talk. It'll shape the way that you speak. It'll shape perhaps the type of job that you get into, or the type of work that you pursue. Shapes everything about the person that you are, where you grow up, the geography that you grew up with, the environment that you grew up in. And so what happens with Greek culture is you get a lot of diversity in geography, meaning a lot of places that are separated, isolated by mountains. And the thing is that within this Greek story, you get a relatively large amount of cultural diversity in a relatively small area. From Athens to Sparta, if you put it on a map, is about thereabouts from Cincinnati to Columbus. Okay, so 100 miles, give or take. In the modern world, that's not a large distance, and even in the classical world, I mean, 100 miles is obviously longer than it would be today, but you could cover 100 miles, a few days journey, depending on your mode of transportation. The fact that a place like Sparta and a place like Athens can develop such radically different cultures and such radically different constitutions, how they constitute their civilizations, is amazing to think about. And I think that it owes a lot to the geography. The geography of Greece created a lot of isolation. It created a lot of ability for these cultures to kind of incubate themselves, to be able to develop in isolation, so that they can then, when they, for lack of a better term, hatch out of this isolation, out of this incubation, you have, in many ways, fully developed, distinct cultures contained within a relatively small but diverse region. The Aegean Sea certainly is one of the reasons behind that. The mountains, the fertile plains, what you're going to get is a lot of these things are going to develop into a really interesting dynamic of Greek culture. As you can see from the stats here, 70% of the land in Greece cannot be farmed. It's not productive farmland. So what you have is you have a population that's going to be fighting, in essence, elbowing in on one another on land, productive land that is pretty scarce in some areas. And so what this is going to produce is each Greek city-state is in and of itself going to be fiercely independent of its own area, fiercely protective of its territory, of its farmland, because there isn't going to be a lot of it, and in some ways desirous of others' farmland. Okay, and so what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of times in Greek history, and we'll talk about this more specifically with the Athenians and the Spartans, certain times in Greek history where you're going to see empires develop, meaning that cultures that are located in certain areas are going to expand outwards, and in essence, war and take farmland and stuff from other Greek city-states. And that's the thing, guys, with these Greek city-states. They're not like cities like you and I understand cities, where you can travel from Cincinnati to Lexington, Cincinnati to Louisville, Cincinnati to Columbus, Dayton, et cetera, and you're essentially allowed into the city. Right? Cities in the ancient world, and specifically in this case, Greece, they weren't like that. You couldn't just go into the city. These cities were walled, they were defended, they were protected by big giant dudes with big giant swords standing outside. All right. So you weren't just able to sort of willy-nilly walk your way and visit Greek town to Greek town for a lot of different reasons. One was the disease thing. I mean, to bring up a modern connection, people didn't want people from other cities on the other side of those mountains bringing in stuff into their cities, into their populations that maybe they weren't used to. Okay. So again, a lot of modern connections can be made if you read between the lines, guys. These are walled cities. These are deeply defensed places. And these city-states act, as we talked about in our classes, they act kind of like little mini nations. Okay. They're going to be very protective of their borders. They're going to be very suspicious sometimes of outsiders coming into their cultures. When we get to Sparta, especially in the coming days and over the weekend and next week, Sparta is going to be probably the most fiercely protective of its culture, and they're going to write it down in their laws, and we'll talk about those. But there are some things, guys, that we talked about that bring the Greeks together, some commonalities, some things that they do share in common. One of those is certainly going to be language. Aside from, different dialects and different ways of speaking Greek, a Greek from Sparta is going to be able to understand a Greek from Corinth, or a Greek from Thebes, or a Greek from Athens, or wherever. Okay. So in some ways, out on the path, you'd be able to talk with and converse and understand a person from a different Greek city-state. By and large, they're going to practice the same religious ideals. Okay, their choice of gods for each city-state is going to be a little different here and there, but by and large, they're going to choose from the Olympian pantheon. They're going to choose from the Olympian god universe that we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. So, for instance, Athens obviously is going to have the patron god of Athena, and then Sparta, sometimes, Sparta chooses, Sparta had a couple different gods that they chose as patron saints. Artemis is one of them, Apollo another. So you're going to look at different types of gods being chosen by these city-states, but by and large, they're going to all, come to agreement about the power of Zeus, and about how interactive the Greek gods are in their lives. And we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. But always, guys, never forget this. A citizen of a Greek city-state is always going to be a citizen of that city-state first, much more than they would identify themselves as a Greek person. All right. So what I mean by that, guys, is they're going to consider themselves an Athenian, a Spartan, a Corinthian, before they're going to consider themselves a Greek individual. All right. It's different than us. Okay. This is something that we can bring into the modern world, but we don't really have a modern connection for it. So for instance, people who live in the United States of America, if someone were to ask you, or if a couple hundred years out in history, we write about Americans, you self-identify to our culture more than you would your city in modern America. Like, I don't consider myself a Cincinnatian before I consider myself an American. I consider myself an American from Cincinnati. All right. It's opposite of the Greeks. The Greeks identified themselves as a member of their own city-state because they were like nations. First, they're a Spartan first. They're a Greek second. We talked briefly the other day, and we'll look at briefly again this map about what's going on around the region around the year 1200. Just a lot of consternation, a lot of movement of peoples. You get this from time to time. Immigration, movements of peoples is one of the constants about human culture and about just studying human culture in general, no matter the time period you're looking at. Movements of people, immigration of people, for instance, let's just look at modern connections today. People wanting to come to America, all right, from wherever around the globe. That's nothing new. These aren't new things. People move around regions and look for opportunities to better themselves, to better their family, fortunes, etc. All right. In this case, around the year 1200, what has happened in the Mediterranean is in the southern Mediterranean, you have the superpower of Egypt is falling. right, is losing its grip on military and economic strength in the region. And what that does is that causes a big power void in the Mediterranean, which unleashes lots of movements of people to trying to grab and fill in those gaps that the Egyptians are falling from. And what this creates is the movements of people into, and what we understand is this area, and you can see it with the orange arrows there, of the Greeks moving into and creating what we know as classical or early Greek civilization. Your book talks a little bit about, and we skipped over it a little bit, Mycenaean Greeks and Crete and all that stuff. We just for the sake of our course and for brevity, we need to move a little bit past that quickly. But basically, guys, what's happening here is you have a huge amount of population disruption and movement throughout the Mediterranean because of Egypt falling from power. And this then, guys, creates an environment where Greek civilization can now thrive in the Mediterranean and become the thing that we understand it from the sources. During this time period, sometimes typically this is called the Greek Dark Ages, all right? Meaning what that means when we talk about things that are dark ages, all right, we don't mean that to be mean historically, or historians, we don't say that to be mean. We just say it's because it's a little dark. It's not illuminated with sources. We don't really know what's happening. And so what we as historians do is during these time periods, we rely heavily on archaeologists. We rely heavily on people essentially digging up things and trying to piece together pieces of the puzzle to figure out what happened during areas that are a little bit dark, a little bit cloudy. What happens is when we then can start to get a grasp on and identify written sources that can illuminate a little bit this darker era where the Greeks like to believe that they were formed. The Greeks like to believe that they achieved their independence and their cultural formation. The stories that get attributed to this individual known as Homer. Your book discusses Homer. Make sure you read up on that. It's not, but a couple paragraphs. And your book even mentions things like Homer might not have even been a real person. All right. And in some cases, if you read Homer, certain translations of Homer, certain early translations of Homer, he might not, the stories that come out and the way that they're translate into the feminine, meaning that men and women write differently. Okay, if you haven't realized that yet in your journey through life, men and women are different. And we write differently. We have different ways of communication. And when women tell stories, the stories come out differently than when men tell stories. And here's one of the interesting things is sometimes people believe that Homer, the author that gets attributed to this, was written in feminine style. So Homer might have been a woman. Nobody really knows. That's not the point, though. The point is that around the year, and you can see the dates, in the 8th and 9th century, the Greek story starts to be written down, finally. Right? We move from oral culture, where stories are told from father to son, from grandfather to the grandchildren, from mother to daughter, from mom teaching the kids during the day, from your stories around the dinner table and around the fireside at night. Stories start to be written down. And when things start to be written down, guys, they can become historical and they can become truly things that we can look back on with a little bit more accuracy. But right, as we get into these Homeric epics, these Homeric stories that your book talks about, the Iliad and the Odyssey, skipped ahead there, sorry, let me go back a slide. The Iliad and the Odyssey, which are two accounts of the Trojan Wars. The Trojan Wars happening, like I said, I'm not a big stickler on dates, so let's just put it relatively around the year 1000 BC, okay? And these stories are about how the Greeks defeated the Trojans, how they were able to gain some sense of independence, and also is these epics start to tell us who the Greeks were, how they worshipped, what they believed, how they spoke, what they ate, how they dressed, how they engaged in warfare, what kind of things did they celebrate. These are all things that dorky historians like myself find really interesting about these stories. Yeah, the stories themselves are awesome. Everybody's got great stories. But the things that these stories tell us is how the Greeks viewed themselves, how they wanted other people to view them. All right. The one that we want to focus on, as we talked about with our classes, is the one on the right, the Odyssey. Truly, truly one of the more interesting epic stories ever written. And we have a few video snippets that I put in Canvas for us to review on the Odyssey. All right, but short kind of Cliff Notes version of it, synopsis is you have this king of Ithaca named Odysseus, and Odysseus goes off with his men. He's the king of Ithaca, and he takes his troops from Ithaca, and they go off to fight in the Trojan Wars. And they're able to win after, a long struggle, 10 years of struggle. And Odysseus at the end says, "Look at me, I am Odysseus. I have defeated the Trojans, and I did it all myself." And that's where we start to get a little icky, all right? Because that's where the Greeks start to come in and say, "No, you didn't do it yourself, Odysseus. You needed the gods to help you out. And what the gods are going to require is that you thank them, that you praise them, that you say, I did this with the help of the gods." And so a lot of Greek early stories, the Odyssey being one of them, we'll talk about another one here in a little bit called the Oedipus plays of Sophocles. One of the worst things you can do as a Greek is basically say, I don't need the gods. And so what Odysseus does is he essentially commits the Greek sin, for lack of a better term, of hubris. Right? The Greek sin of I can do it myself and I don't need any help from anybody else, especially the gods. And so what happens is one of the hallmark central Greek gods, who we'll talk about in a couple of slides, named Poseidon, the king of the sea, the god of the Aegean and the Mediterranean, the controller of the winds and the seas. He essentially curses Odysseus. He sends him on an odyssey. That's where we get that word from. I've gone on an odyssey. What that means is you just kind of gone on a meandering, wandering journey where you can't get to the point that you want to get to. And all Odysseus wants to do is get home to his wife Penelope and to his son. All right. His son's name was Telemachus, and he just wants to get back to his wife and his son and have his kingdom of Ithaca back again. But the gods aren't going to let him do it because he thinks that he can do it himself. And so Odysseus is essentially cursed to wander the seas, and he'll lose all of his men, and he'll lose all of his treasure, and he'll just be floating aimlessly out in the sea until he gets to have this kind of face-to-face with Poseidon. And Poseidon essentially brings Odysseus to the brink of death. And he's not going to kill him because the gods aren't going to do that. They're not going to kill you, but they're going to teach you a lesson. And finally, Odysseus is like, all right, uncle, I give up. I need you. All right, please help me get home. And as soon as Odysseus does that very human thing of saying, I need the gods, I need your help, guess what happens? He's able to make it back home to Ithaca and back home to his wife and his son. So it's a really cool story, all right? And I hope that you enjoy those video snippets that we put on the website about the Odyssey. And that brings up a greater thing that we want to talk about with how the Greeks viewed not just religion, but viewed their entire cultural existence, their entire self. I like to call it, and I love this picture, I like to call it the snow globe effect. All right. The Greek worldview, and this is a very comforting worldview. We talked about this in class. We're no longer, we don't view ourselves, you know, if you believe in, you know, modern, you know, scientific foundations and facts, that we aren't the center of the universe. Earth is not the center of the universe. We inhabit a small, very kind of speck on one of the spirals of our Milky Way galaxy, amongst 100 billion, million, trillion other stars and suns and galaxies and planets. And what that means for humans is that sometimes that leaves us feeling rather insignificant, that we're rather small, and is there anything really out there that's helping us, or is this just all completely random? That's a modern problem. The Greeks didn't have that problem. Guys, the Greeks lived in a very self-contained snow globe type of culture. I kind of think about it sometimes and like, man, I think that that would have been fun to live in, because you are the center of the world. Everything is happening to you. All right? The Greek gods are interacting with you. You're interacting with them. Every once in a while, the Greek gods will shake up the snow globe and send the world into havoc because they're ticked off. They're mad that the people are not honoring them properly and giving them proper sacrifice. So the Greek gods will throw the snow globe around and teach that you better realize how in charge we are, says the Greek gods. And I find that type of existence comforting sometimes, because it's not random. Nothing, guys, and here's the point, nothing in the Greek world happened by randomness, by circumstance, by coincidence, by happenstance. Nothing in the Greek world was without meaning. Everything had a meaning. The gods were trying to send you a sign. Something happened. A tree fell down. You got hurt. Something happened with your life. Something happened with your crops. Nothing happened randomly. Everything was a sign from the gods and was something that you needed to interpret, fit into your life, and figure out how you can react to it. That is the cosmic drama. That is the belief that you are kind of on a play stage. You are an actor in a play, and you have a role to play. All of us human beings, from the most powerful king, from the most powerful god, down to the smallest humans, even the poorest, sometimes most insignificant feeling human, you all have a role to play, like you would in a play that you were putting on at your school. What is your role going to be? What is your contribution going to be? What's your verse in the play going to be? That's what's so cool about the Greeks. And that's what I love talking about with the Greeks, is that they, by and large, not everybody believes everything, but by and large, their culture believes that. What's my role going to be? What role do I play? What am I going to contribute to this play? Greek mythology, guys, oh man, we could talk for hours on Greek mythology. And I'm sure some of you have had classes on Greek mythology, or have been interested in Greek mythology and went and Googled it up and looked it up, and maybe even hopefully read a reputable book on it. All right. Greek mythology, though, guys, we want to fit it into our course. We want to fit it into the general scheme and the general outline of what we've been talking about so far this semester. Okay, so let's use some familiar words. Let's use some words that we're used to. so far that we talked about with the Mesopotamians and that we talked about with the Egyptians. First and foremost, guys, the Greeks believed, there's that word again, in many gods. Polytheistic. The Greeks believed in a multiplicity of gods, men and women, all right? And the Greek gods were mostly anthropomorphic, okay? And there's that mouthful of a word again, meaning that the gods, most of the time, were in human form. The Greeks did have, and we'll get into this with the Olympian gods, they did have sometimes the ability to turn into animals. For instance, sometimes Zeus is portrayed as an eagle, all right, flying around, you know. Sometimes Athena is portrayed as an owl, because Athena was the goddess of wisdom, and owls have been traditionally seen by all cultures, way back even into ancient cultures, as wise old birds. You know, what's that old saying? A wise old owl lived in an oak. The more he saw, the less he spoke. The less he spoke, the more he heard. Why can't we all be like that wise old bird? About that one, about that nursery rhyme that gets stuck in your head about the wise old owl who lived in an oak. That's why you guys enjoy hanging out with the cool professor from time to time. As we talked about, guys, Greek gods are extremely active in daily life, all right? But the Olympians that we're going to talk about, they weren't the first Greek gods, okay? And here's where we got to get, not quick, but we got to do kind of, you know, Cliff Note version of what happened with the Greek gods. But guys, this is also one of the video snippets that I put up comes from a modern interpretation of this story and the Greek gods that we look at with that movie Wrath of the Titans, okay? And that's where we're going to get a couple of these names and stuff that are going to come up and make a little bit more sense. So the original Greek gods, the formative Greek gods, okay, were known as the Titans. All right, they were the original gods of the region that sort of came out of the primordial ooze that was Earth before people were even around. Okay. And the leader, one of the leaders, or comes to be one of the leaders of these Titans, was known as Kronos or Kronos or, you know, Kronos. Say it a couple different ways. All right. But Kronos, you can see him depicted right here on our screen. Now, this is where the story gets a little, like, I don't know, bizarre and sometimes a little odd, but you got to take it with a grain of salt, and you have to start to interpret, guys. You got to read between the lines and find out and try to interpret what Kronos was and what he was meant to be. Kronos was married to a woman named Rhea, a god named Rhea, and they had many children. And the issue was that every time Rhea would present Kronos with her child, Kronos would eat the child. He would consume the child, and the child then was sort of, didn't kill it, but ate the child, and the child was alive in Kronos' belly. Now that's bizarre, certainly, as a foundational story, but stick with me for a minute. So he eats Poseidon, who will eventually become the god of the sea. He'll eat Hades, who eventually will become the god of the Greek afterlife, the Greek underworld. And then, obviously, Rhea is like, well, you keep eating all my kids. Like, so I'm going to stop presenting you with children because you keep eating all my kids. So what she does is she smartly, so the story goes, instead of she has Zeus with Kronos, and instead of presenting Zeus, she presents a gigantic rock, a boulder wrapped up like a baby, and presents the Kronos. And of course, Kronos eats the rock, and into the belly goes what he thought was Zeus. But Rhea had hidden Zeus and raises him on essentially the side behind the back of Kronos. And so the long and the short of the story is that Zeus then gains power, grows up into comes to his manhood, his adulthood, and he wants to free all of his siblings that had been eaten by his father. And so he goes to war with Kronos. It's father versus son, another really common theme in classical culture, religious belief systems, father versus son, power struggles. And Kronos is defeated by Zeus, right, in this battle. And that's where, guys, if you want to go right now, or maybe you've looked at it and hopefully watch it again, that scene from Wrath of the Titans, where Hades and Zeus are fighting against Kronos, and they're using all their power to defeat Kronos. And so, guys, what happens is Zeus is able to get Kronos to essentially spew forth to regurgitate, to whatever the heck you want to call it, all the other gods that he had eaten. So guys, think about it. What type of thing in the geography, remember, geography is always at play here. What type of thing in an environment, what type of thing in a geography would be seen as something that explodes forth, formative, early, creative forces exploding out of something? Yeah, hopefully the bells are going off in your head. Sounds kind of like a volcano. And that, guys, is what Kronos was essentially. He was a creative, volcanic, just as we think volcanoes today, angry, unpredictable, eruptive. And that's what Kronos was. He just, boom, he just explodes. And out from Kronos, after he's defeated by Zeus, comes all of the Greek gods that we know and that we come to understand as the Olympians. And guys, what they're able to do, and just to finish the story and close this loop, the Greek gods, Zeus, the head god, Poseidon, the god of the sea, Hades, the god of the underworld, and the Greek conception of the afterlife, and some of the other gods, are able to imprison Kronos. He's not dead. He's just defeated. They're able to shove him underground and imprison him in a place called Tartarus, where it's really hard to get out of. We get all these cool Greek things like the labyrinth, and it's just a really cool conception of religious belief that we can't go too far down the wormhole in that, or we'll be here forever. But think about that. If Kronos is that volcano, volcanoes do go dormant, correct? They go back underground. We never know when they might erupt again. We got to keep him in prison. We got to keep him down so that he doesn't explode and go come back and destroy our culture. Okay, really cool how the Greeks envisioned Kronos and used their environment. All right, because the Greek islands, guys, if you look at Ring of Fire and those types of places, they sit on a pretty active volcanic plate, as does Italy and Rome. And we'll talk about a really big volcanic explosion at Pompeii during Roman history that causes lots of different types of things. So, guys, active volcanoes are going to be very much a part of Greek classical life and culture. So to imagine Kronos as that volcano that exploded way back when to release all the gods and then has sort of gone dormant is a really cool image to have in your head of how the Greeks conceptualized their religion. Zeus, of course, is the head god. He's the final decision maker. He is the guy who defeated Kronos and was able to then pacify and create this Greek experience. But guys, the thing with the Greek gods is they're not like gods that we conceptualize today. And I'll move ahead here real quick and just show you some pictures of Zeus. All right. Take a look at Zeus. Take a look at all these Greek gods and goddesses. They're the perfection of the human form. And that's how the Greeks envisioned them. They're muscular, they're big, they're perfect, right? Physically perfect. And that's the key. They're physically perfect. But morally, they're imperfect. Judgmentally, they're imperfect. The thing about the Greek gods that's so cool that the Greeks envisioned with their religion is that much more than today, they gave their gods all of those types of human imperfections, of whimsicalness and unpredictability and sometimes immoral behavior. Zeus encapsulates all of those things. Zeus can be charmed. Zeus can be charmed by men and women alike. All right. Zeus does not act like what we understand is like, if you say, if you're Christian and you have this belief in Jesus of Nazareth as the Son of God and the Savior of the world, as well as, like I said, other religious conceptions. I mean, take for instance, the Hebrews and then Judaism with their belief in Yahweh. That God is, Jesus, Yahweh, God. They're perfect. They're perfect morally. They can do no wrong. That's not like the Greek gods. The Greek gods are very different and are much more human, in essence, than what we understand with our modern conceptions of what we like to believe in with gods. But these Greek gods are superhuman in their strength. They're superhuman in their physicality. They can do whatever they want. They live forever. They're immortal. Right? Zeus can, for instance, he throws lightning bolts and brings about thunder. Poseidon can summon the seas, and one breath of his from his chest can create hurricanes and typhoons and all that stuff. So they have superhuman power, but they have very human foibles. They have very human eccentricities about their personalities. One other cool thing that you see about Zeus here is you can see the eagle on the picture on the left. Zeus sometimes, like I said, takes on different forms, and the eagle was one of those forms. Zeus has a wife, Hera, all right, who was also one of the Olympians, but Zeus has many children from many different wives, godly wives, human wives. Zeus was not monogamous, as we like to say. So again, another very human attribute there. Zeus was all that was man. Zeus was manly man, and Zeus as manly man can have as many children with whomever he wants, whenever he wants. And so Zeus is not constrained by what we like to think of as being moral, or the moral constructs that we sometimes put on monogamous relationships and marriages and things like that. Zeus doesn't behave like that because he's a god. He can do whatever the heck he wants. So we'll see Zeus from time to time comes down and interacts with human beings. And by interact, I mean interact with human beings. And you get these kind of half god, half human situations. All right. Off the top of my head, we have, Perseus is one of these individuals from the movie Clash of the Titans, Wrath of the Titans. Hercules, although the Greeks referred to him as Heracles, Hercules is one of those half human, half god individuals that's created by Zeus between Zeus's interactions with a human woman. Zeus's brother, as you can see there, Poseidon, the god of the sea, extremely important. Let's take a look at a picture of Poseidon here, right on the right. Again, take a look at just the essence of manliness. I mean, Poseidon has been at the gym, working out, if you know what I mean. All right, just the depictions of the Greek gods, in many ways, are very, very masculine. Okay, and you can see Poseidon there holding the trident, and he's sort of got that faraway glance on his face, and he's kind of, again, Poseidon, same way, kind of whimsical, unpredictable, kind of like the oceans. Storms can blow up from time to time. You don't really see them coming. All of a sudden it's a storm. It was just a nice day. What's going on? Somebody ticked off Poseidon. Something must have happened. Let's make some offerings at Poseidon. Hopefully the weather will calm down. Those types of things. Okay. Other gods include, other Olympian gods, Apollo, Athena. We'll look at a couple pictures of them here in a minute. But the Greek gods really do come alive in those epics and those dramas that we have talked about. We talked about how we as human beings are role players on this stage. And we have roles to play. And those roles, the Greeks believed in fate. We are all kind of fated to play our role. You have a part to play, and you have to play your part how you're supposed to do it, and you have to accept your part as fate. And if you can act however you want as a human being, all right? But you must, in the end, accept your fate. You must accept that you are but a human being and that you need the gods. And if you don't do that, then you are committing that sin that we talked about with Odysseus, the sin of hubris, all right? The gods must be obeyed. The Greek gods must be, no matter how whimsical and immoral they are, you have to accept that they're in charge, or they'll do terrible things to you. All right, the Oedipus plays of Sophocles are another one of those instances. All right, read up on the Oedipus plays of Sophocles. Your book talks a little bit about Sophocles towards the end of chapter 5. Sophocles writes a play, again, short Cliff Notes version here, writes a play called the Oedipus Plays, where Oedipus Rex, the king, all right, disobeys the gods, does some things where he commits these sins of saying that he's kind of in charge and he doesn't need the gods, and he won't accept his fate. He goes to visit, right? One of the things about the Greek gods that we talked about, sorry, I hit the wrong button there. One of the things that we talked about the Greek gods is they were very into visiting oracles, visiting individuals who could foretell the future and try and figure out what the fate was. And the Greeks called these things oracles. We'll talk more about those, and if you have questions on those, please ask. And what happens with Oedipus, back to close that loop up, is he doesn't want what the oracle tells him, because the oracle tells him some bad stuff is going to happen to him, and he goes, no, that's not going to happen to me. And the terrible things that the oracle tells Oedipus that's going to happen to him actually end up happening to him. All right. And so the bottom line is, guys, that as much as you try to avoid it, you can't get outside of your fate, the fact that you are a human being and you need the gods. Apollo there on the left is another Greek god, the Greek god of music, the Greek god of oracles, the Greek god of singing, that type of thing. You can see him playing a very common classical instrument called a lyre. It was kind of like a handheld harp. Right? Very, very, very important couple of Greek gods here. These are the children of Zeus, all right, and Hera. You have Athena on the left, who becomes the patron god of Athens, goddess of wisdom, goddess of skill, goddess of outthinking your enemies. The Athenians always believed that they were smarter than the rest of the Greeks. We can outthink you. We can outmaneuver you in battle. We can outthink you with our smart intellect. You get all those, Many of the most famous, Greek mathematicians and Greek playwrights, many of them came from Athens. On the right, you get the Greek god of war called Ares. Okay, and Ares is again depicted the height of masculinity. He's got his battle helmet on, raised above. He has just vanquished a foe, so he's taken his helmet off. And the Greeks, when you went to war, all Greeks prayed to Ares for victory. Okay, you would pray to gods and goddesses for victory. You would pray to them for guidance and wisdom from Athena, or guidance in battle and victory from Ares. A sibling of Zeus is this really interesting Greek god. Again, depicted in the modern sense in those movies, The Clash and The Wrath of the Titans, which I put a snippet of on canvas. Hades, the brother of Zeus, is in the modern world sometimes seen as like a hellish god, a devil figure in charge of like a hellish landscape. Not how the Greeks saw Hades in reality, if you really get into it. Hades was simply the god of the afterlife. He was the god of the underworld, where the Greeks believed you went when you died. Here's the thing that, again, I don't want to spend too much time on because we can go down a wormhole on it. Greek belief in afterlife was extremely varied and extremely complex, and varied from city-state to city-state and from individual to individual, from family to family sometimes. The Greeks had many conceptions of the afterlife and of the underworld, as they like to call it. But one thing that they generally were in agreement on was that this god Hades was in charge of it. And you had to, in some ways, gain the favor of Hades if you wanted to continue into the underworld or into the next life. Hades is sometimes flanked, as you can see, by a kind of disturbing, violent-looking god called Kerberos, which is a three-headed dog. And the story goes with Kerberos that when you get into the underworld, or when you get into the afterlife, you want to leave. You want to go back to here, this world, because the Greeks generally, their view of the afterlife and the underworld, that it wasn't, not necessarily that it wasn't a nice place, it just wasn't as nice as the living world. It wasn't as nice as this earth, as this world that we live in. And so what happens is the Greeks believed that you would get there and you'd try to leave. You'd try to get out and come back. But Kerberos, the three-headed dog, was there to eat you if you tried to leave. It was there to hunt you down and make sure that you stayed in the underworld. And some images of the Greek afterlife, some modern, some ancient. The one on the left is an ancient image on a Greek pottery piece there, and you can see Charon, and you can see on the right Charon depicted a little bit differently. Charon was the ferryman. He was the boatman who took you across this thing that the Greeks called Styx. The river Styx was the separator between the world of the living and the world of the dead, this life and the underworld. And in order to get there, you had to pay Charon. You had to pay the ferryman across to get to the other side, or you didn't make it. And so what the Greeks would do is they would bury a lot of their dead with money, right? And sometimes they would put it on their eyeballs. Sometimes they would put coins, gold coins, silver coins, precious metals, on the eyeballs of the deceased victims before they were buried, so that when you got there, when you got to Charon, you would be like, well, okay, and you would flip Charon a couple of gold pieces, and you were able to hop on the ferry to get across. That image on the right, it's kind of disturbing. The Greeks, like I said, guys, by and large, afterlife, after this world, wasn't necessarily the nicest place for the Greeks. That's why this life mattered to many of the Greeks much more. That's not necessarily, if you want to make a modern connection, we tend to, by and large, people in the modern world tend to believe that the afterlife is going to be much better than this world, that the afterlife is perfection. It is paradise. It is communion with your ancestors, with those who have gone before you, and with the God that you believe in. Not so much for the Greeks. The Greeks believe that some different things about the afterlife, and we'll get into that as we continue. So, friends, that brings us to a close with our first look at the Greek notes. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did, talking about it. So if you want to, send me a message, leave a comment, and I'd be happy to talk with you about those things moving forward. But until next time, my friends, all the best.